story of Suffolk County Stout starts with founder John Hall. John was inspired by great English breweries and beer styles. And even the first beer of Goose Island was Honker's Ale, an English style bitter. Many of the original beers at the Clybourne Brew Pub were inspired by English beers. Fast forward a couple years to the early 1990s, and his son Greg, then brewmaster, wanted to commemorate Batch 1000 at the Clybourne Brew Pub with something special. So he made a recipe of a big malty Imperial Stout. He wanted to age it in bourbon barrels. And it just so happens he made the connection of legendary master distiller Booker No, Jim Beam. Booker sent him a couple of Jim Beam bourbon barrels, and Greg aged it for about 100 days. And that was the first batch of Bourbon County Stout. Many people don't realize that Imperial Stout has its origins in England in the late 18th, early 19th century. It was made by the great porter breweries of London, and Stout was the strongest version of porter, and the Imperial Stouts were the strongest version of Stout. They were also known as Russian Imperial Stout or Russian Stout because they found favor in the export market to the Russian Empire. Present day Goose Island Brewing team wanted to bring these things together. John and Greg's love of English beer and brewing, our love of Imperial Stout, and come up with a new beer that brought all these things together. We landed on the idea of taking the Imperial Stout recipe that we use for Bourbon County Stout and swapping in the American malt, hops, and American bourbon barrels for English malt, English hops, and English whiskey barrels. Now the malt and the hops were relatively easy to find, but unlike Scotland to the north, there's very few English whiskey distilleries. So we went on the hunt, and after a quick search, a very familiar name came up, Adnams, a legendary English brewery.
Hi, I'm Fergus. I'm head brewer at Adnams, which is a brewery right on the east coast of England. When I say right on the east coast, I mean if I look out my window, I see a lighthouse. On a nice sunny day, I can just about persuade myself that I can see the Netherlands across the North Sea. So Adnams has been brewing here since 1872, but in 2010 we also added a distillery. So when Mike from Goose Island came over to the UK to sort of visit some cask beer breweries, which obviously Adnams is well known for, we also started talking about whether we could do something with whiskey and aging some Goose Island beer in some of our ex-whiskey casks. So for the whiskey, we make 3 different washes, one barley, one that's a mixture of wheat oats and barley, and one that's mostly rye with a bit of barley as well. So each of those make a whiskey, and then we age those in oak for a minimum of 5 years at the moment. So we use some French oak, some American oak, depending what wash we're using. So for the single malt whiskey, we use French oak with toasted heads, which adds, I guess the whole flavour of the whiskey comes across as quite honey, a little bit of apricot. It's really nice sort of clean, easy whiskey. So that's the whiskey that Mike's taken to age the Suffolk County Stout. So I'm looking forward to trying it, and hopefully Mike's putting some in the post right now. Cheers.
So for the malts used, we sourced all the English malts from Crisp Malting Group, and they're located about 50 miles away from the Adnams Brewery, so it's all in that same region of the southeast of England. The hops are East Kent Goldings, about 100 miles away from Adnams, and the traditional hop of England. They would have been used in Imperial Stouts for hundreds of years. And of course, Adnams Single Malt Whiskey casks. Their barrels are toasted. They're actually wine barrels that are used for whiskey. They're toasted, not charred like bourbon barrels. And so they bring out different notes, vanilla, a little bit more prominent oak, coconut. Really interesting to work with. The Adnams Single Malt. So this is a 5-year-old single malt whiskey, and it's worth noting that there's no peated malt used in this. There's no smoke. It's really clean. There's a lot of honey, really nice fruitiness, a little bit of apricot, and a prominent oak character. Again, it's toasted barrels. It's not very common for whiskey. So tasting the beer, immediately, of course, it's an Imperial Stout, so chocolate is a prominent note. You get a little bit of burnt sugar. What I find interesting is that apricot note also translates. There's a fruitiness there. There's obviously a lot of similarities between Bourbon County Stout. It's the same malt bill, just with English malts, but it's the barrel that really stands out here is the key difference. You know, bourbon is so expressive and so much vanilla, so much caramel and coconut, and it's all here, but something about the toast rather than the char and maybe the age of the whiskey. Those elements are there, but they resonate in the beer a little bit different than Bourbon County Stout, and it's very enjoyable.
So thanks, Mike, for sending over the beer. We've got some bottles of Suffolk County Stout, which has been aged in our single malt whiskey barrels. That's really something.
Whiskey notes.
Lots of single malt whiskey notes in there. Well, I think it's come out really, really well. Cheers, Mike. Cheers, Goose Island.
I want to say cheers and thank you to Fergus and the folks at Adnams. Thank you for getting us the cask. I think this has really made quite an interesting beer and a tribute to the history of Goose Island, John and Greg Hall, and Bourbon County Stout. It's going to be available this spring in the Chicagoland area. Cheers.